Hello, welcome to Drugs Unwrapped with me, Rob. Today I am joined by Sarah, by Jamie, by Verity, and also by Hannah. So today we are chatting all about stigma and stigma associated to substance use. So first of all, why is stigma such a big issue? Because Jamie, it's a topic, it's a an issue that is constantly talked about. So why is it such an issue?
Well, I think, Rob, from our experiences of obviously delivering drug and alcohol services, what we're seeing from a stigma perspective and a stigma agenda is that it has significant issues because it can lead to severe and wide-ranging negative consequences for those individuals that access our services and society. And some of the key reasons why stigma is so critical is because those individuals are obviously accessing our services to receive support, whether it be practical or to access psychological interventions. But if you're experiencing stigma and you come in to us for those psychological interventions, one of the main things around stigma that I find from my experience of working in this area of work is the impact that it has on someone's self-esteem and self-worth. So stigma can severely damage an individual's self-esteem and sense of worth. And this can lead to feelings of shame, guilt, and not feeling or belonging to anything. Now, that then could potentially lead on to then other issues, such as the impact on someone's mental health. And that in itself then as well, compounded with obviously people who are accessing our services because of dependency issues, that can create barriers to us access, that's to them accessing our services.
Like what Jamie alluded to, do you find that stigma then is probably one of the biggest barriers?
I think stigma is interesting because you can have a very personal stigma, um, and it coincides with how you sort of view yourself in the world, but you're also subject to your culture and your community stigma as well. Um, so you could very well be in a place where it's absolutely, or seemingly it's all right for you to, maybe personally you think it's okay for people to access services, but you could be living in a community where being seen accessing it is something that's really, really frowned upon, and vice versa, that sort of thing. So I think maybe with stigma, it's almost fighting on kind of like a dual front. It's yourself and your internalized stigma, and kind of stigma in the community that you live in as well.
And I think my point very much links into what you're saying there, Verity. I think one of the most damaging things around people feeling like they're stigmatized and being judged is that it can lead to people not feeling able to be open and honest about what's happening for them, and it almost can sort of silence people. And obviously, particularly for our services, they're very much based on the need for people to be open and honest about what is happening and what is going on for them, for us to be able to provide them with the right support that they need. So I think it can be really, really damaging in that respect, because I think it means that people then lose their voice and they lose that ability to be able to be open and honest about what's happening for them.
I think that internalization of those negative stereotypes can exacerbate some of the conditions around mental health, like depression, anxiety, and that. And I think in its totality, then we're also talking about that social isolation, isn't it? From exclusion, of being on the peripheries of any kind of support systems or anything because of that stigma. And sometimes stigma leads to social exclusion, where people feel ostracized or are actually ostracized from social groups. So the challenge is to get from A to B, and B being in services could be an immense task to be able to step over the threshold of your doorstep and go to where services are. And I think that's where stigma can be really challenging and be debilitating as well, and create even more isolation for those people as well. So it's got a lot to say for itself in regards to people accessing our services.
It's every service as well, isn't it? Is when you have that stigma that you feel towards yourself, either that, like Verity said, that's something that you feel about yourself, or whether you've learned it from others. It breaks down your barriers to other services. You're less likely to go to the GP. You're less likely to feel like you can go to the shop as well. So I think it isolates you even further than just from accessing a drug and alcohol service. It puts a block on your whole life, and kind of like what Jamie was saying, with it causes, you to feel more low. You're looking at increased depression, anxiety. It's that vicious circle then that, the lower you feel, the more likely you are to continue to use to manage that and to self-medicate. So I think it not only causes a barrier, but perpetuates the issues that we're trying to treat. And kind of further to what Sarah was saying, it's not only a barrier to access and service, it's a barrier to engaging with service, because even though you might come in, kind of refer yourself in, access that support, you may not actually have any kind of belief in that service, depending on the experiences that you've had to date. And you might not be open and honest, like Sarah said. So then, even though you've come through the door and you've accessed that service, is that support then meaningful, because you're so worried about what people have got to say, and if they actually trust you or believe you, or do value you as a person. So I think it's far more entrenched than just if it's a barrier to people, accessing it. It goes so much further and just permeates like every aspect of your life when you're subject to it.
If you think about drugs though, and you think about alcohol as part of that, and then obviously prescribed medications, and you think about drugs that people take every day, over-the-counter medications, cup of tea, cup of coffee. Why is there that stigma then associated to substance use? Because at the end of the day, it's probably pretty hard to find someone who doesn't take drugs.
Misinformation is
In
a
what
big
respect?
one. That everyone who does drugs is a criminal. Everyone who does drugs has got potential higher risk of spreading bloodborne viruses. You're of a certain social class, depending on what type of drugs you take. Those kind of things, I think, lead to that.
I suppose it comes into language as well when you think about, and this kind of links into some of the stuff that's been happening in Barod recently around language. But kind of when people refer to others as, oh, they're getting clean, like illicit drug use is inherently dirty, apparently. And I suppose like it's that hangover from the 80s, from kind of the epidemic that was not caused by drugs, it was caused by unsafe injecting practices and unsafe sex. It's not the drug that was the problem. So I suppose it's that misinformation, like Jamie said. And yeah, I think when we think about kind of like social class, I suppose within alcohol, just to make a point within that, is you even have that social class within, so if you're a mum and you drink a glass of wine, or 2 glasses of wine, or a bottle of wine, that's one thing. Or if you have a gin and tonic, that's one thing. But if you have 4 cans of cider, it's a very different kettle of fish. You're viewed differently, because of, I guess, the class associated with that drink. So I suppose, when we look at substance use being more obvious, there's usually a socioeconomic element underpinning that's caused trauma, or lack of resilience, or something that's led to substance use. And I think then it's this kind of wanting to, I don't know, maybe wanting to turn a blind eye to certain aspects of society that don't kind of represent that sort of idyllic idea that we would like to represent ourselves, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree with Hannah. I think one of the other things that I missed out there is the media. Media can play a big part in this as well, with the way how it's people who use drugs are represented in all different ways, whether it's glamorized or, discussed in a real negative connotation as well. Has a huge impact on people who access our services, and also working within harm reduction. lack of understanding about harm reduction and what its purpose and function is.
The drug isn't the problem necessarily, and I think there's a real misunderstanding around that, and it links into what you were saying about media, Jamie, because I suppose, you know, we've all seen, oh, this was this person before they used heroin or crack or amphetamines, and this is this person now. And a lot of the time, if you actually look into it, they don't look that way because of the drug itself. They look that way because of, you know, what life has dealt them, because of mental health issues, because of self-neglect, because of, you know, maybe socioeconomic issues, maybe, you know, kind of eating disorders. Like, they don't look that way because of the drugs. They look that way because of other things. But it's easier to just blame it on the drug. Like, it makes me think about like what PSE lessons used to be like, oh, if you do this, this is what you're going to end up looking like. And it's just not true.
It's almost like a lack of insight to see people and understand people that access services as individuals in their own right with their own stories. And it's almost like dehumanizing people by grouping them together and making assumptions, making judgments, you know, having these really preconceived ideas around and stigmas around what somebody who uses drugs must be like and what their behaviors are going to be like. But actually, we all know that every single person that we work with is an individual within their own rights. They have their own stories. And I just think people just don't look at it that way. They don't seem to have that insight for lots of different reasons that you've just mentioned.
You ask anybody, you know, what artists they like, or, you know, anything like that, and you just think, well, you know, if you said to someone like, oh, do you like the Beatles? Yeah, I like the Beatles. Right, okay, well, drugs. You know, like, why is that okay? Why is that acceptable? Why are you able to acknowledge them as people with lives, with talents that were kind of then I don't know, like sort of like added to by psychedelic drug use and things like that, and you can acknowledge that, but then when it's a real life person that's in front of you, why is that then different? And, you know, I really struggle with that. I suppose it's when you turn around and you sort of say to somebody like, well, do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you vape? And they really struggle to get to grips with that, and quite often become deflective or defensive.
You know, in terms of young people, does stigma look a little bit different for young people? I asked that in terms of, is there a point where young people potentially see drug use as quite cool to a degree, you know, that they potentially are saying to their mates, oh, I had a spliff at the weekend, and, you know, or I tried this, or I tried that. So like the stigma maybe isn't as present as maybe what it would be kind of whilst you're in adulthood, so to speak. Like, is that something that you guys see, and is there a time when actually things change, when actually stigma does start to play a little bit of a role?
I think that's kind of you're almost talking about a different thing there. I think that becomes status within your group, and I think there is you know, in certain groups there is always a sort of a level of status depending on who your peer group are and the cohort of people that you're spending your time with. But I think certainly young people do experience a lot of stigma, and it might come from outside of their peer group. So there are stigmas against young people and assumptions that are often made about groups of young people. And then if you throw into the mix then groups of young people that are using drugs, then there's even more stigma. And even more judgment and even more kind of preconceptions around how those young people are going to behave. And actually, again, it just kind of comes down to, you know, the fact that they lose that, they sort of lose, they get grouped all as one. So again, it kind of loses that individualism, and the, you know, the skills that they've got and the wonderful things that they bring to the table get overlooked by the fact that they might be within a group of young people that are using substances regularly.
I agree. I think a lot of the stigma, it comes from school, from parents, from professionals. It's very external. Because ultimately, you know, you're not born with views, are you? You know, you learn those, and I think that when that stigma is communicated to young people, that's when they pick that up. You know, and a lot of that will come from them being stigmatized themselves, you know, whether that's obvious or not. I think there's definitely an assumption that, you know, all teenagers that use drugs are naughty or engage in antisocial behavior, and it's just not true. You know, most of the people that I work with are absolutely lovely. You know, they're really nice, they don't get in trouble, they do well in school, they keep their heads down. You know, most of them are really nice kids. I shouldn't say kids, sorry, young people. But they are. Um, and it's really unfair on them to be kind of painted with a brush that it just doesn't suit them. And I think it's, you know, it's easy to say, oh, this teenager's misbehaving, it's because they're using drugs. It's a lot easier to say that than to identify what's really going on. You know, and there are potentially other people that are misbehaving, not using substances, that aren't necessarily getting the same treatment, just because they're not using substances. I will say though, you know, I have noticed a little bit of a culture of bullying, where, you know, some people are being targeted by bullies for using drugs, is their words, and like their families apparently not caring about them and coming from rubbish families. So I have started to notice a little bit of that, which is really sad. So a bit of like a ganging up culture maybe within some schools. But I think with vaping, in some ways, the stigma almost goes the other way around. Like if you don't vape, you're weird. So it's quite interesting, and I think the term status is really interesting, Sarah, because I feel like there's almost like a status and but also a hierarchy. And again, it's almost like certain drugs are okay to do, certain drugs are not okay to do. And I know that exists in the adult world as well. But I think you start to see these themes emerge in schools, depending on the trends at that time.
I suppose looking at it from a different perspective as well. But we're talking about stigma and the negative impacts, and this in association with drugs. But what are the benefits of using drugs as well? Do you know, like how if someone's using a drug, it could be because of life in general. For young people or old, doesn't matter. It's quite stressful these days. There's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of issues going on. You know, you look at the news, you look at the media, there's a lot of negativity around, there's a lot of stereotyping around, a lot of finger pointing at each other. And sometimes drug use can bring people together where you've got a common interest, where you feel that the common stresses and strains, and also looking at alternatives. And sometimes drugs can relieve the stress, relieve the pain that you may feel in, whether it be physical or emotional, whether you be young or old. And I think that sometimes then is where you create like those subcultures where, you know, substance users or substance use is seen out on the peripherals, but when really they're potentially groups of individuals who are together, that are feeling that human bond and connection, which people do need. People need, you know, we're very like pack animals, aren't we? And you know, we gravitate towards each other. And when you get isolated, that's that start of then that kind of social exclusion. And I think sometimes we can hone in on the negative stuff, but there's also quite a lot of positive things there in relation to why substance use is there as well. And I just feel that, you know, that lack of education and understanding as well about why people self-medicate as well, and you know, and people do also use drugs in isolation as well. You know, there's a whole host, so they don't need to be in a community or in a subculture. Those drugs can, you know, facilitate the benefits that they need to be able to survive and cope on their own. So I think, you know, we've also got to bring in the flip side. I know people don't like to, you know, don't like to hear that people actually use drugs to enjoy themselves and to potentially self-medicate, but sometimes that is the truth.
Sometimes it does work really well for people, like you just said. You know, some people are able to live very fulfilling lives while using a substance. It works really well for them. They found something that gels well with them. Like you said, it creates a community for them. And when you're thinking about like holistic approaches to things, if that works, if that makes you happy, you're not having negative side effects from it. You've now got a group of friends, you've got a hobby that you do together, and this is actually making you feel better. Why should anybody judge you for that? You're not hurting anybody, you know? And I think we mentioned it on another podcast before, like for some people, it's quicker to contact their dealer than to try and book a GP appointment.
I think as well we have to be pragmatic, and that's where like, harm reduction definitely plays a part in that. Actually, there must be an enjoyable or benefit to taking drugs for people. Otherwise, why would they take them? You know, that benefit may be to eradicate something, or to not think about certain memories, or to ease the pain, or whatever. But you know, there's always that element of enjoyment or benefit. And you know, I think we do have to be realistic with that. And drugs have played a massive part in our society for such a long time. They play a significant part in everyday life. Like Han, you already mentioned, you know, in terms of the Beatles, and you could list so many different musicians and bands, you know, that they got their inspiration from probably some of the greatest songs ever written and performed, you know, and they were done so under the influence of substances. Some of the greatest books and literature has been written under the author being under the influence of certain substances. So, you know, it is part of life. That's why I always struggle with the incredible amount of stigma associated to substance use. One thing that was actually mentioned as well that I'm quite intrigued about is actually, the stigma within and across different substances, you know, and I think probably, you know, a lot of people would instantly think of heroin, you know, and everything that goes along with heroin, and therefore the stigma associated to it, which may be different and may be less intense in terms of from a stigma perspective to another drug. Is that something that you do see, and also something that, you know, you hear about now and again, whether it's true or not, is even groups within, or people who use the same substances, but they administer it differently. So for example, you know, people who inject versus people who smoke the same substance, that actually the stigma between the two, is that something that you guys see? Is that something that actually happens at all?
I think over the years, I think if you went back 10, 15 years ago, I think it was more prominent, the different classes of different users, or the methods in which people use drugs was very defined. I think polydrug use has become very much the norm. So I think that's kind of almost, not completely, but broken down those barriers between the differences between individuals. You know, many years ago, there was a lot of stigma attached to groin injecting. Groin injecting is pretty much the norm. You know, people that are inducted now, you know, normally the process of smoking and then working your way through the types of injecting. Now you can literally start straight away by injecting in the groin, smoking crack, you know, instead of going your way through cocaine use, and finding different ways to administer cocaine, injecting cocaine, the different classes that you see now, you know, the different demographics that you see where people are administering in different ways, and how people get their drugs as well has become easier. So that's broken down those barriers, I think, to accessibility for substances. And I think that's potentially why there's less barriers, or not less barriers, sorry, less definition of each subgroup. It's all kind of intermingled in now. You know, NSPs, needle syringe programs, are more accessible. More people could potentially think about, and then, you know, act on the idea of potentially accessing injecting equipment, and have the appropriate harm reduction information, advice, and hopefully will retain in services and all the rest of it. But I think, like with regards to human behavior, I think, you know, pretty much every aspect of our life, we can become dependent on certain things, from food you know, right through to sport and being, you know, hyperactive in the way that you're really involved in your in fitness and etc. So I think any element of it. So I think that seems to be obliterated in many ways. But I know, like Hannah was referring to, you know, some of the young people that might have been experiencing bullying because they are different, shall we say? But what we still see, you know, in the mainstream is that it's frowned upon in general, isn't it? So you know, in some elements, but alcohol isn't still. You know, alcohol is still up there as, you know, very much accepted. But the nighttime economy and poly drug use and different substances and the different substances that you see in circulation, again, that's a whole different demographic of individuals and different nights in our different areas across Wales that will differ due to the locality and the availability of substances as well.
Do you say alcohol because it's legal? Do you think it's because of the legal status?
Yeah, and it's part of our fabric of society, isn't it? For such a long time, you know, many of us live in industrial areas where, you know, it's aligned with work, it's aligned with sport, leisure, and I know, like, attitudes towards alcohol has changed significantly, but it's still very much there, you know. It's, you know, we've had our own discussions on it in our podcast previously, but yeah, there's a different attitudes for sure, and people are choosing different routes and methods to kind of consuming different substances, and that's down to their own personal experiences as well, you know, and personal traumas, I suppose.
So how do we overcome this then? Like you mentioned the media, and obviously the majority of the population will get their news and hear about substance use via the media. Are there any other ways that either we can or we do try to minimize stigma? And also, do you think there will ever be a point where we can eradicate it?
I think, Rob, I give you an example. I was in a meeting some time ago where a drug service was like, we were looking at how do we engage people of a certain demographic who use a certain type of drug, and it was suggested that we use those type of style, American style propaganda, drug propaganda, with regards to getting people into services, and that was from a drug service. So, you know, it's wild. But I think for us, it's like with regards to media and media representation, I think it's encouraging accurate and positive representation of our services and the people that use our services in whatever form of media to be able to change, like, public perception, and that it's not just about, you know, the negatives or the criminality element of it. It's making people understand why and how people use substances, and to ensure that then that leads on to appropriate education and awareness. So you're increasing, like, the public's awareness and understanding of drug use and alcohol use, and the realities of what stigma and stigmatized conditions of groups can have on individuals, for them to progress, to be able to feel a part of society, to be able to progress in their recovery, you know, to take that road of recovery. Then I'd like to think then that would potentially get the building blocks in place for a support system, so people are supported in their community, so they feel like they've got the resources in their community. That's not just reliant on services. It's the resources are in the family, you know, because stigma can happen in the family as well. The resources are in the community. So, you know, when you step out your front door, you feel and identify with your neighborhood, with your neighbors, and everyone can, like, support each other in an ideal world. That is in an ideal world, and I know it's not ideal.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jamie. I think it's about threading it through absolutely everything that we do. I think we've got a responsibility to ensure that we're challenging judgments and stigmas. And, you know, it's about challenging some of the language that we hear. It's about educating people. It's about making sure that when people come into access support as well, that we do a really significant piece of work with people to ensure they understand what stigma is and how they themselves may have been stigmatized, to break down some of those barriers, to ensure that they can really fully engage with the support that they're accessing, and also that they become part of the they take on that responsibility for challenging some of those stigmas that they receive themselves as well, and that they feel confident enough to be able to do that. And then I think it's about trying to tackle it from kind of a larger perspective as well. So as an organisation, so things like the manifesto are so important, that we are challenging media, we are challenging government initiatives, we are challenging other services when they're using inappropriate language. You know, it just needs to be threaded through everything that we do, because it's not going to go away overnight. It's such a huge issue, and I think we just need to keep chipping away at it and just be hopeful that we can make a significant difference.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like you said, in an ideal world, kind of stigma wouldn't exist. But it's, you know, stigma and stereotypes do go absolutely hand in hand with one another. So the sooner that we can, you know, contradict and eradicate stereotypes and the continuous, you know, continually perpetrating stereotypes, I think reducing stigma will kind of like go along with that as well.
Being the last to go, I'm probably just going to end up repeating what everyone said, but I think it's the balance, isn't it, between de jure and de facto eradication of stigma. You know, we've already said the likelihood is it's never going to disappear, but we need to challenge it. I think lobbying for legal changes is obviously really, really important, which, you know, we do anyway through the conferences and things like that, trying to raise awareness on a political scale, which I think in current times, not to get too political, is quite frightening, given the fact that certain political parties are on the rise. I think that's really, really frightening when we think about protecting certain groups of society who are suffering from stigma. I think it's a very real threat. I would have liked to have thought that most people were far more tolerant than that, but there we are. But on the other hand, it's that de facto element. I think, you know, it's not just shutting your laptop at 5 o'clock, going home and living your life. It's really challenging your family and your friends and people that you come across in your day-to-day life on what they say, you know, on the language that they're using, on the things that they're saying, and actually, you know, without sharing any sensitive information, highlighting that you work with people every day that they're stigmatizing, and how they're real people with real stories, and that they're really lovely people, and that they've just been hard done by other factors, and that it's not drug use that makes them a certain type of person, if you like. It's, you know, they're doing this because they feel they have no other options sometimes. Obviously, we do know that a lot of people are using drugs very happily, and that's absolutely fine. But people who are dealing with what they might describe as problematic substance use, or, you know, that they feel they have dependency issues, they're there because of other reasons. And, you know, just scapegoating drugs is not the answer. We need better provisions for people. So yeah, I think just challenging the people that you know is the smallest scale. You know, we can change laws, that's really big, but we know that there are protected characteristics, yet people are still stigmatizing those protected characteristics in real life. And while obviously you can't change opinions, you can plant seeds in people's minds. And I suppose within that then as well, the protected characteristics is things like what we've got in the blueprint around adding certain things into the list of protected characteristics, or getting rid of, like, I think it's the alcohol clause, is it, Rob, that the exclusion clause that says that it's a choice if you're suffering with a dependency around alcohol. So I think a balance then of campaigning on a political level, but also just spreading the word really to people who actually might listen to you in your life.
Yeah, you make a good point. Yeah, so there's a specific alcohol exclusion clause within the Equality Act. So people with either current or historic alcohol dependency, which, you know, potentially could lead to certain forms of disabilities, those individuals may not be protected from discrimination under the Equality Act. So you know, the Equality Act is not necessarily very equal, really. Very quickly before we finish, and I know it's been alluded to, and I can probably guess the answer a little bit. If we were to decriminalize or even legalize drugs, would that have a major impact on stigma faced by people who use those substances?
I think, in short, it may have a positive impact on some stigmatizing behaviors, but it may increase other stigmatizing perceptions, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it would potentially have a positive impact, but I don't think it's the absolute fix. And I just put my hands up because I just wanted to say, like, I think this is a really, really complex topic, but I think ultimately it comes down to the crux of it's about being kind to people and being kind to others. And I think if there's one thing we can, it sounds a bit cheesy, but if there's one thing we can take away from this that we can all do, it's about facilitating a place of kindness and really encouraging everyone to be kind to others, because ultimately that's what's being stigmatizing and being judgmental, is being unkind to other people.
I think it has the chance of improving people's lives. I think that in itself is worth it. I think it's a very complex issue and it's not going to solve anything overnight. And I think that it will probably, you know, with a lot of these issues, the more it kind of comes into public perspective, you tend to see more backlash to it, right? So I think there will be elements of increased backlash towards these kinds of policies, but it really does have the chance to improve the lives of people who do use substances, and, you know, their families as well, and the wider community. So I think that in itself would probably make it worth it.
It could be really divisive, like what Verity said, but when you look at, you know, throughout history, when big moves are made in policy, where something controversial is then backed by the government, or, you know, kind of something like decriminalisation, I think the biggest thing it could do isn't necessarily it's not necessarily going to be having an impact on those who are stigmatizing others, because I think ultimately people will dig their heels in with their opinions no matter what. Unfortunately, as much as you try to shift that opinion, sometimes people won't budge. I think the biggest thing it can do is let those people who are being stigmatized know that someone's got their back, that actually, you know, the government, the political bodies, the criminal justice system, who they feel have been targeting them for such a long time, possibly, that they're saying, you know, actually, we get this now. We understand what you've been saying to us this whole time. And I think that's really powerful. So even though you're going to have people saying cruel things to you, like Sarah said, being unkind, it's this kind of firm line from the government of, no, we're not tolerating this. You can't do this to people. And it just gives people that moment of respite of, finally, someone's got my back in this.
Just want to say 100% agree with what Sarah just said about just people being nice to one another. That would make a whole host of difference regardless. And keeping it really short, I think we need to be viewing drug use as a health issue.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, that's it for now, and we will see you soon. All right, bye-bye. If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.